From 1861 to 1865, the United States was embroiled in a bloody civil war between the Northern Union and Southern Confederate States. The reason was the conflicting political and economic interests of the two sides, headed by the struggle between Union President Abraham Lincoln and Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The Navy was an important factor in the Civil War, with the main tactical role of the Northern Fleet to be enacting a blockade of ports and vital coastal areas, commonly known today as the Anaconda Plan. The capture of these strategic points in the coastal regions of the South was intended to stifle the economy of their southern enemies, resembling the way in which the anaconda suffocates and crushes its prey. The superiority of the Northern forces allowed the Union to begin implementing their plan from the first year of the war. The Northern Fleet was also strengthened by capturing bases and landing points on the shores of the southern states. The effectiveness of the blockade increased, and the economic effects on the Confederacy worsened with each passing day. In the spring of 1861, the Northern Fleet consisted of around 70 wooden vessels, fitted for combat and ready to sail into battle. By December 1864, the Northern Fleet had grown to nearly 700 ships. This shows how the Civil War itself was the catalyst which fueled the naval construction industry in the Northern Territories, with the fleet growing tenfold in just a 3-year period. In February 1861, the Confederacy established a naval division of its own, headed by Stephen Mallory. Mallory suggested building a small fleet of modern battleships that could very effectively deal with the wooden ships of the Northerners. At the start of the war, the Northern Union didn't possess a single warship, relying on simple sailing ships and wooden steamers. In an attempt to gain superiority, the Southern states decided to build a series of armored ships. Between 1862 and 1865, the construction of 50 medium battleships began. The average cost of each of the battleships was around $300,000. Mainstream history tends to neglect the many naval aspects of the Civil War, focusing most attention on the success of ground operations. Russian researchers were even more surprised to see the battleships used. They assumed an 1862 battleship would look something more akin to this sailing boat, sheathed with defensive iron plates. But what was seen in American drawings and photographs from the mid-1800s was very surprising. This is the first ironclad warship built by the Confederates, known as the CSS Virginia. It harnesses subtle 19th century technology, which maritime experts have said was a miracle to be completed in only a single year, especially when considering the conditions in which they had constructed it, previously having neither private construction dockyards nor shipyards. So, let's examine the official narrative for the Confederate battleship CSS Virginia. In 1861, the Confederates took over Norfolk in the US state of Virginia, where the hull of the wooden 40-cannon Merrimack frigate fell into their hands. The operating steam engine in this chassis was made to be armored. Since there were no iron plates left, the armor was made of average, everyday rails, using the only available Confederate factory located 90 miles northwest in Richmond. So, according to the official narrative, the CSS Virginia, the first Confederate ironclad battleship, was built roughly on the knees of an old wooden frigate using second-hand rails. Researchers were amazed at the final product, with the Confederate engineers of the mid-1800s displaying exceptional craftsmanship and no fear of innovation. But the Union states weren't far behind. They implemented an equally remarkable project, culminating in the construction of the warship called USS Monitor. Swedish immigrant John Ericsson proposed a project to President Lincoln for a fundamentally original design for a ship that had no equal in the world. Lincoln approved the project, and 100 days later, the USS Monitor was born. In the mid-1800s, a remarkable feat was accomplished as a completely new vessel was constructed within a mere 3-month time frame. However, it is plausible that the project itself entailed a relatively straightforward design, resembling an unassuming iron enclosure. Let's read the description. The entire hull of the ship was made of iron. The armor covered not only the port sides of the vessel, but also the bow. The heavily rotating armored gun turret was fitted with two 11-inch rifled muzzle loaders. The turret was covered with multi-layered 8-inch thick armor. During this period, it was believed there was no cannon on Earth that could pierce this armor. These photographs show the warships built by the Confederacy, resembling a semi-submersible. But the Union battleship was even more reminiscent of a prototype submarine. Researchers were most surprised that these vessels were outfitted with rifled muzzle loaders, as if they were in the days of Napoleon. Historians wrote that in order to fight against these warships, specially reinforced cannonballs were created. We also have a description of a lively battle between two battleships. Look at this picture of these two wonderful ships firing at each other with cannons on board. Researchers suggested this displayed a technology gap. Warships as if descended from the pages of Jules Verne's novels, yet these magnificent ships use cannons modeled after the Napoleonic Wars. The only real difference being the reinforced cannonballs, used for piercing through the armored hulls. From this point onwards, the Union forces, eventually becoming the United States, produced a whole series of different warships. Look at these various different designs. The USS Virginia, USS Monitor, USS Dictator, USS Louisiana, USS Tennessee, and USS Galena. Researchers began to question the official narrative, with one Russian historian saying it's as if the Americans came up with a fictional description for the Civil War. They invented the causes for the outbreak, beautifully described the ground battles, kept vast records of names of the participants and how many perished, before staging thousands of photographs. He suggested that both sides of the conflict were in fact working together and had staged the entire thing to unite a divided continent under one flag. The civilians of the time would have wondered why there were no naval battles recorded. After all, the short history of England and Spain in the Americas contains dozens of naval battles, but not a single one was recorded in the American Civil War. Researchers who follow this line of questioning suggested it was only afterwards that the American battleships were invented, and to make them more exciting, they gave them unique shapes and interesting designs. Let's take a closer look at this Galena battleship. As historians tell us, the armor consisted of horizontally arranged, forged iron strips with overlapping edges. These strips were placed like roof tiles, with the lower edge of an iron strip overlapping the upper edge of the one beneath it. Look at this photograph. We can see striped armor assembled without rivets and welding. In what manner were these strips held together? Each one being 52 millimeters thick. Looking at the very edge of the water, a cannonball is stuck there. Returning to the battleships of the Confederacy, researchers questioned how it was possible to design and manufacture 22 warships in a time span of just 3 years in an area that seemingly had no shipyards or shipbuilding facilities at the start of the war. Look at this fantastic photograph of the Manassas battleship built in 1861 and looking like something straight out of an alternate history novel. Researchers believe these photographs depicted technology that was too advanced for the 1800s. So, what is the truth? Did these ships truly exist, with the Civil War acting as a catalyst for naval innovation? Or were they merely fictional devices, as suggested by Russian researchers, devised by historians to deceive the nations by displaying technology that was actually beyond their capabilities?